this is quite a radical and transformative document. Not first and foremost because of what it says about climate change. Though many, perhaps far too many, have chosen to dwell on that aspect of the document. Important, though, what he has to say is on the question of climate change, but rather because it offers a prophetic message. It is bold and it is direct, quite easy to understand, relatively speaking, because of its intended audience. I'll say more about that in a moment, and because of the way it is able, almost effortlessly, to synthesize spirituality, ethics, science, ecology, and society. And I think Mick has already given us a reasonable indication of that. But most of all, it is a transformative document because it represents a seismic shift in mainstream Christian thought about the relationship between nature and humanity. And he draws inspiration from a great many sources. Of course, from his predecessors. How could you not? Even if you were just tactful, you would need to do that. And he's very tactful. But he draws inspiration, interestingly, from the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople, Bartholomew I. And he acknowledges that and devotes a whole page to his indebtedness to the patriarch. In other words, he sees that as absolutely fundamental to ecumenical dialogue. And then later we find out fundamental to interfaith dialogue. The relationship between nature and humanity. It is interesting that though he does quote his predecessors, he quotes most extensively from bishops' national and regional conferences, never done before in an encyclical. And he does it primarily from national and regional conferences in the Third World, with just one to the United States as a token gesture. That tells you something. Very few have picked that up, I suppose because they haven't read too many previous encyclicals. And of course, he quotes and refers extensively to the findings of science. And he tells us, faced with a global deterioration of the environment, I want to address every person who inhabits this planet. The reality is that Francis does not belong to the Catholic Church. First and foremost, he belongs to the world. And that's what Catholics find it a bit difficult to understand. He explicitly draws a parallel in presenting the encyclical to the encyclical that John the 23rd issued in 1963, Pacem in Terris. And he did that, those of you who will remember, in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Just as the world then stood on the brink of nuclear Armageddon, so today he makes it clear we stand on the edge of environmental breakdown. And the key to that breakdown is precisely the relationship between nature and humanity. This is the crucial theological dimension of the encyclical, largely glossed over in mainstream media, and I must say, it appears to have gone over the heads of a good many Christian circles. He tells us, and I quote, the creation accounts of the book of Genesis contain in their own, and he uses the words, very important, symbolic and narrative language, telling a story, narrative language, profound teachings about human existence and its historical reality. They suggest, this is part of the quote, that human life is grounded in three fundamental, and people still haven't grasped it, in three fundamental and closely intertwined relationships. The relationship of human beings with God, with other human beings, and with the earth itself. It's not just that there are three relationships, but that they are intertwined. And in this encyclical comes very close to the Confucian understanding of heaven, earth, and humanity. And he knows that. And note in this quote that I've just read out the radically anti-fundamentalist biblical hermeneutic, symbolic and narrative language, and the equation of the relationship between humans and the earth with the relationships between humans and one another and between humans and God. This is a statement not just to the effect that environmental issues are important. Of course it is that. It's a radical theological claim. That human life is centrally defined by the human-earth relationship. That spiritual life is centrally defined by the human-earth relationship. Indeed, the relationship with God, this is again not properly understood in much of the commentary, is mediated through our relationships with our human brothers and sisters and with Sister Mother Earth. And this leads Francis to reinterpret the controversial account in Genesis, which he's not the first to do, of course, but easily the first encyclical to come even close to it. The account in Genesis that humans have, quote, dominion over the earth. This reinterpretation can be found, we know, in a number of works by liberal theologians, but only for the first time in a papal encyclical. He wants us to be in no doubt about what he's telling us. He says, the Bible has no place for a tyrannical anthropocentrism unconcerned for other creatures. It goes on. It is true that we Christians have at times incorrectly interpreted the Scriptures. We Christians have incorrectly interpreted the Scriptures. Now we have no option. We must forcefully reject the notion that our being created in God's image and given dominion over the earth justifies domination over creatures, other creatures. The biblical texts have to be read in context with an appropriate hermeneutic, recognizing that they tell us to till and keep the garden of the world. Genesis. Tilling, he says, still quoting, refers to cultivating, ploughing, or working, while keeping means caring, protecting, overseeing, and preserving. This implies a relationship of mutual responsibility between human beings and nature. It's a radical statement. Alone, we can't do it. We are mutually responsible for social outcomes. He states explicitly that exploitative readings of Genesis have been incorrectly interpreted, that nature is not an instrumental good, that humans have a relationship of mutual responsibility. He says, and again I quote, the universe unfolds in God, much more radical than most have interpreted to be. The universe unfolds in God, who fills it completely. Hence, there is a mystical meaning to be found, it's his terms. This is a mystical understanding of the Christian message. There is a mystical meaning to be found in a leaf, in a mountain trail, in a dewdrop, in a poor person's face. The ideal is not only to pass from the exterior to the interior, to discover the action of God in the soul, but also to discover God in all things. God is present everywhere. As one commentator has remarked, Laudato Si may turn out to be politically influential. It is, as of now, theologically transformative. And this reading paves the way for what is perhaps the most important and deepest insight of the encyclical, which I don't think even liberal theologians or liberation theology has quite got to up to this point in time. And that is that the exclusion of nature and the exclusion of the marginalized, the poor and the vulnerable are one and the same thing. There's not that and that, it's one and the same. Why is that? Because they are both the result of the same mindset, the same spirit of domination. The spirit of domination which excludes nature, and the spirit of domination which excludes human beings. And the mindset based on the profound indifference to the harm that results from such exclusion. He says that very clearly more than once. It is this spirit of domination that now threatens human beings themselves, incoming generation, and threatens to create what he calls a planet of debris, desolation, and filth. Can't use stronger language than that, can you? And on the basis of this profoundly spiritual understanding of the current human predicament, Francis is then able to pass severe judgment on our political institutions and our political leaders. He says, as often occurs in periods of deep crisis, which require bold decisions, we are tempted to think that what is happening is not entirely clear. Such evasiveness serves as a license to carrying on with our present lifestyles and models of production and consumption. This is the way human beings, the psychology is terribly important, contrive to feed their self-destructive vices, trying not to see them, trying not to acknowledge them, delaying the important decisions and pretending that nothing will happen. End of quote. And addressing world leaders directly, he asks, what would induce anyone at this stage to hold on to power only to be remembered for their inability to take action when it was urgent and necessary to do so? He could well have been speaking to our Catholic